Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining from, and welcome to the GMF webinar titled Iran at the Crossroads, Regional and Global Repercussions. The Operation Epic Fury, as it's named in the United States, has quickly become one of the most consequential developments in Middle Eastern security in the recent years. It raised a number of critical questions, not only about immediate military objectives, but also about its broader political, regional, and actually global implications. We have three excellent speakers to address this issue today. So I will start with Beth Senner, who is Resident Distinguished Fellow at GMF and who was earlier Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Mission Integration. Christina Kausch, who is Deputy Managing Director and Senior Fellow at South and Wider Europe Program of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, rotating her time between Madrid and Brussels. Last but not the least, Dr. Dan Kleiman, who is first and foremost my immediate supervisor, but also Vice President at GMF for Global Power Shifts. So we will first have a discussion, have a conversation with the speakers for 45 minutes, after which I will turn to you for questions. In order to ask questions, I will ask you to use the chat function. You can actually start putting in your questions before the panel discussion is over. But once the panel discussion is over, I will turn to your questions to ask them to the speakers. And when you're posting questions in the chat box, please be mindful to also address it to one of the speakers. So I will start with a question that I will ask to Dan. So Dan, what political, military, and strategic conditions led to the launch of Operation Epic Fury? And what immediate developments triggered the decision to act?
Thank you, Özgür, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. Let me kind of divide this up into kind of immediate and then conditions and kind of long-term developments. So the immediate trigger here very much for the United States and Israel was essentially an opportunity for a decapitation strike against the Ayatollah Khomeini and some of his senior leadership. They had insight on a gathering and essentially decided to take military action. In terms of conditions, so beyond that, conditions that were very much, I would say, encouraging this decision. So on the U.S. side, the Trump administration, of course, has been engaged in negotiations with Iran for kind of a new nuclear deal. And the administration had become convinced that Iran ultimately was not going to accept sort of what it had on offer. For the U.S. and Israel, there was also concern that Iran was rebuilding its stockpile of ballistic missiles after the conflict last June. And if this continued, that it would have much more capability to use in the future. Kind of stepping back on the long term, of course, Israel has for many years, if not decades, perceived the clerical regime in Iran as an existential threat. On the Trump administration side, and this I think is worth noting, this administration has very much tried to pursue, you might call it a foreign policy of consolidation. So trying to take kind of national security challenges or wars and wind them down to limit kind of the commitment of U.S. resources and attention. We saw this with the Gaza ceasefire, where it pressed both sides to kind of an agreement. I think the Trump administration's approach to Venezuela is similar, trying to shift the regime to, again, kind of limit U.S. exposure. I think Iran has very much been seen in this light as well as a threat that has absorbed for decades U.S. attention, diplomatic attention, as well as military resources. And so, again, I think from that kind of consolidation perspective, that was animating this move in general.
Thank you very much, Dan. Beth, I would like to turn to you now. What are the main strategic objectives of the operation, and what are the critical success factors? And at what point do you think the United States and Israel are in terms of accomplishing these goals? And what would an exit strategy look like?
So that's a big question. I want to pick off of what Dan was said and remind people about Netanyahu's visit to Mar-a-Lago around the new year. And reports are that during that meeting, Netanyahu laid out the case for the threat posed by Iran's missiles, growing missile arsenal, which obviously created this imperative for Israel. And a lot of this stems from, if you go back to the October 7th, the conditions in the region really come from October 7th. And then in April of 24, when Israel struck Syria, and for the first time, we had this direct exchange between Israel and Iran. So that's really an important context. And since that time, and Operation Midnight Hammer, the nuclear one, then at that point, Iran was basically, almost defenseless. And so Israel felt very strongly that they had an opportunity to end this once and for all. So Israel's objectives here are really about regime change, right? Yes, it's about missiles, but you'll notice that in these strikes, it was Israel that carried out the decapitation portion of this, and they're continuing to go at it. At the same time, we kind of hear that America wants to have maybe a Venezuela kind of option. Now, I think that for the United States, so Israel very much, they want this decapitation, end of this regime once and for all, end this threat, and they're okay with chaos. They're okay with that. They just don't want this Islamic regime in power. But the United States is very much more all over the map in terms of what we want. Now, I think that the military options are very clear and very laid out by General Kane and Hegseth yesterday. They want to make sure that Iran cannot project power outside of Iran. Nuclear, missiles, proxies, Navy. So those four things, very, very clear. But then we're hearing about the Kurds and the potential for us supporting, kind of Afghan style, that we're going to support some kind of uprising inside, at least in that Kurdish area. So I think that the U.S. political objectives are still very much in flux, not decided at all. And so, where this is going in terms of U.S. policy, I think they're still figuring it out as they go along. They've thrown the pieces up in the air, and we're going to have to see where they fall, and they're going to just be picking up things as they go. So mission creep, all these ideas that we hear about in terms of Iraq, Libya, etc., are still at play. And so we don't know how this will end because they don't know.
Beth, I have the impression that there isn't actually an exit strategy that the United States and Israel have agreed on before.
Look, if you don't know what your political goals are in a war, I think, all of us who have studied war, Dan, you've got to have that end state in mind, ends, ways, means. And when you don't really know the ends, then you get mission creep. Or you get us pulling out early and leaving just a you-know-what show in Iran, complete chaos, civil war perhaps. We don't know. But yes, we don't have an exit strategy because we don't know what our goals are.
Thank you very much, Beth. That's very interesting. Krishna, I would like to turn to you. Of course, we all know that Europe is not a monolithic entity, and there are actually multiple views from Europe looking at this. But what are some of the stakes for Europe and the European Union? And what are some of the views in Europe about this operation?
Yeah, thank you, Özgür. Let me, before I come to your question, pick up on one of the points that Beth just made. I think it's pretty clear that the goals of Israel and the United States, to the degree that we have a grasp of them, are pretty far away from each other. And I think that's going to be a problem moving forward, because as time moves forward and the political cost and the economic cost for the Trump administration grows in this war, this discrepancy is going to grow more and more. because, as Beth was laying out, Israel is seeing this as the opportunity of a generation to do away with the Islamic Republic. Whereas from the United States perspective, this is really the pain threshold really gets lower and lower the more time advances. So I think, just to lay this out, I think this is time is really of essence in evaluating the situation. On the European question, so the Europeans have, in the run-up to this entire affair, the Europeans, by declaring the IRGC as a terrorist organization, have implicitly taken themselves out of this equation, at least as far as mediation was concerned, because they were no longer welcome to these talks or to these conversations from the Iranian side. That said, right now, the reactions from Europe to those strikes have been a pretty mixed bag. I would say, in general, it is a continuation of the approach by the Europeans that we've seen also in reaction to other Trump actions, which is avoiding to condone military action while staying aligned with U.S. policy in a very, very cautious and one might say one-sided approach. The E3 have issued a statement that, that on the one hand, somehow distant itself from the strike, underlining that they were not part of it, but condemned, but not otherwise not making any critical reference to the way the strikes come about. The German Chancellor even went so far as to say this is not the time to think about international law, as if international law was a footnote. And I think by many this is seen as a strategic mistake by the Europeans. There have also been other voices. The Spanish Prime Minister in particular has been not the first time, one might say, in the last months and years, the only one to really come forward and adopt a much more forward-leaning language, condemning the strikes and the way it was run, and saying it was against international law. But that said, the Europeans are really bystanders in this sense right now, and at least in security terms, don't have an important or any game-changing role, but they will suffer the security and economic fallout from this.
By the way, as we're speaking, at least one EU member state has been targeted by Iranian missiles, Cyprus. It was, of course, intercepted. But so when does the point come when the EU thinks that actually Iran is also targeting EU member states?
Well, the strike on Cyprus, that was a drone attack on a UK base in Cyprus, and it is my understanding that it was not clear, it couldn't be determined where that drone really come from. It was a Shahid drone of Iranian making, but it could have also been fired by Hezbollah. So the reaction from the UK and from other European governments has been to defensive response, to send ships to Cyprus, to the Mediterranean, to raise the bar of, raise the measures of defense. But so far, it would be a stretch to say that this is a direct attack from Iran on European soil.
Although we
course,
do have the
Beth,
strike
please.
on the French base also in the Gulf, which again, hard to know whether they were aiming or no, or, they're just throwing a lot of stuff. But
Well, the fog of war, of course, makes it very difficult. But yesterday, my own country, Turkey, was apparently targeted by a missile. The Iranian chief of staff denied that it came from Iran, but I think the indications that it did. There is information on the social media that another one was intercepted last night. This morning, actually, Nakhchivan, the Azeri exclave on the border of Turkey, the airport there, was again targeted. So the reaction in Turkey was something between surprise and shock, because we thought that Turkey trying to play a constructive role and actually trying to create the off-ramps for Iran would not be targeted, but it was. So it is really difficult to anticipate where Iran will stop these days. So Krishna, I will get back to you with another question on the regional impacts, but I really want to turn to Dan. So Dan, what are the implications of this episode? I mean, not only the operation, the way Iran is responding, etc., on the global balances. So, like China and Russia must be watching with a keen interest. How does this influence their calculus?
Absolutely. And a couple thoughts on China and Russia, and then I'll kind of go closer to the region. I think for China and Russia, I mean, there's probably a few takeaways. One, despite being close partners of Iran, you haven't actually seen them sort of play a sort of very helpful role as this conflict has unfolded. And I think that's been kind of interesting and notable. Of course, both China and Russia have critiqued the U.S. and Israel operation as violating international law. Very much kind of to be expected. I mean, the reality is their own calculuses tend to be focused very much on kind of raw power. And so it's unlikely that this will, for example, embolden China to take action across the Taiwan Strait. I think it'll be interesting to see. Iran historically in the last years has played a key part of a key role in Russia's war machine, providing both actual kind of drone components and drone manufacturing expertise. And kind of whether Iran is able to kind of continue playing that role going forward may change. So I would say you see both China and Russia watching, but not playing sort of key roles in the moment. I think in the region, this will very much shift some of the relationships. I mean, we've seen in the last year kind of friction among some of the Gulf states, including even the UAE and Saudi Arabia. I think many of the Gulf states seem to have been surprised that they have been widely targeted by Iran in this conflict. And you see already a beginning of kind of a coalescence among these countries in ways that we haven't seen. So I think you may see much kind of tighter relationship among Gulf countries. I think with their relationship with the U.S. will also kind of change in two ways. I think one, they're going to want to cooperate more with the United States, seeing this threat, again, assuming we'll see where things land. But if the kind of clerical regime continues, they will see Iran as much more of a kind of clear and present threat and want to work with the U.S. At the same time, I think they will feel that they need to engage in more self-help and have more of their own kind of capabilities as well. So let me stop there. I imagine other folks also have some views on this.
I will actually turn to Christina on the views from the Middle East, Iran's neighbors. But then there is a follow-up that I would like to ask to you. So I'm curious about why China has not, at least publicly, done much to prevent this from happening, because there is actually an economic counterdependency between China and Iran. China is Iran's best client for hydrocarbons, and Iran is, one of China's main sources for energy. So Beth, I also see you nodding.
Yeah, I
shaking
mean,
your head.
I think that we really overstate the Iran-China relationship, and I think we tend to look at China and its relationships through the lens of an American-type relationship, an alliance relationship, but that's not what it is at all. It is a always with China, it is about them, it is about transactions. And in fact, when you look at the Chinese relationship with the Middle East, they've always favored, much to Iran's sadness and complaints, they favored the relationship with Saudi Arabia and UAE. And you see this, that even though they have this strategic treaty, nothing has really come of that. And so, yes, they have been extracting cheap, discounted hydrocarbons from Iran, but their relationship with the rest of the Gulf is much more important to China currently and in the long term. And it's not about alliances.
Yes,
China
but
and Russia don't have alliances.
But even from and actually I was also asking from China's self-interest. So China actually has an interest that oil
They have an
continues to
interest in
flow
the
from
straits
the
being
Basra.
open. Yes, and they have sent an envoy, but they also have, probably 4 months or more of reserves in
Reserves.
hydrocarbons, so they can wait this out. They've sent a ship in, and we're starting to see ships their transponders, their communications from at least one cargo ship I saw today is saying, "We're Chinese, don't hit us," which is exactly what they did in the Red Sea to avoid Houthi attacks. I'll stop and let
That's
others start.
interesting. Okay,
No, those are
Chris,
great points. Do you mind, Oscar, if I jump in for a
please, Dan,
second?
please.
I think, I mean, this shows China is very much kind of an economic actor in the Middle East, but geopolitically has never been able to sort of align its influence with its economic footprint. And the reality is, of course, we've seen China criticize the operation that's happening, but it really doesn't have, I mean, if anything, to do more than that would have shown that it had no ability to kind of shape events on the ground. So I think there's not a lot beyond sort of what it's done to sort of prevent this, because really China's influence has been very much economic. In Beth, I think you're spot on. The relationship has really been kind of Saudi Arabia and UAE and that side of the Gulf. And so also China necessarily wouldn't want to go to the mat for Iran in this case.
Okay, thank you very much. Christina, before turning to you, I would like to remind our audience that actually now is the best time to post your questions using the Q&A function because we'll turn to the audience soon. Yes, Christina.
The questions that you've asked earlier, you've asked about China, you've asked about the Gulf states, and so on. And I think the one factor that unites these is the economic factor, is oil, because as Beth and Dan have also alluded to, what China is doing now is a continuation what it has roughly been doing over the last years. China is the Gulf country's biggest oil client. It has long-term contracts there, and that is its main interest. And in order to secure those relationships, it has largely been free riding on American security provision to the Gulf. And that is, and so there is really little incentive at this point for China to intervene politically in any way beyond any sort of sweeping statements. So it's just behaving rationally, I guess, in that sense. And as far as the Gulf states are concerned, yes, it's true. The Gulf states the GCC states were surprised that they were targeted. But I think the main interpretation of this is that they were not targeted for their own sake, but they were targeted in an attempt by the Iranian to raise the economic costs for the United States, which is raising global energy prices, closing the Strait of Hormuz, and directly attacking the world economy and U.S. economic interest. And the key to that economic interest is the continuous flow of oil and gas provision by the Gulf states. The Saudi Aramco, the main state oil company in Saudi Arabia, was directly targeted. The Qatar had to close down production, taking off 20% of global LNG production off the market by a single geopolitical event. Those are very, very high numbers, and they may in the short term just lead to spikes in oil prices. But if this carries on over weeks and months, the damage to the global economy, to inflation, will be significant. And that will damage Trump, of course, not only him. And I want to say also about Russia, let's also not forget, yes, it is true, Iran has had a partnership with Russia in defense, and the Shahid drones came from Iran, but it is my understanding that today Russia is producing these drones itself on Russian ground. So I'm not sure to which degree this relationship is really that crucial for Russia in that sense. And also Russian state coffers and war coffers are empty, and a raise of the oil price and energy prices would benefit Russia first and foremost. I've just before this meeting, I've looked at the oil price. A few weeks ago, Brent crude was at $65 a barrel. Now it is at 83. So if that carries on, Russia will be one of the main winners, and it will fill its empty state coffers again, and that will enable it to hold out longer in Ukraine as well.
Thank you, Christina. Let's actually stay with you. So Beth actually mentioned that one of Israel's objectives is regime change in Iran. So you have been attending various events on the evolving situation, and I know that among other things, you're also focusing in this region. So can you tell us a little bit about the scenarios regarding political developments in Iran? I mean, regime change, regime collapse without a new political build-up or a civil war, and what the implications of either would be for the region.
I think one thing that we can hear from many analysts, observers these days, that regime change by airstrikes alone is illusionary from a military point of view, or very unlikely, and also not sustained by historical evidence. So that alone as a goal is questionable. But if we take that aside for a moment, it seems to me that there was a blatant miscalculation by the Trump administration, thinking at some point that that Iran was so weak, and also maybe based on a lack of intelligence, in that sense, that Iran was so weakened by the developments since the Hamas attacks on Israel in 23 that Beth described earlier, that winning, or toppling the regime would be easy. Now we've seen this is not the case. It becomes clearer and clearer, which also explained the switch in rhetoric by the U.S. government. In the last couple of days, I've heard very little about regime change. And so, yes, they've started big. They've started killing the supreme leader and some very important political and military figures. But as we hear from Iran experts these days all over, the Iranian constitution has been built on, the Iranian state has been built on the assumption that there will be counter-revolutions, a revolutionary regime. The Iranian constitution has clear, explicit provisions of what happens, of the contingency that kick in when there is a sudden death of the leader. And that is what very likely is happening right now. There's a committee formed that is an interim leadership. If they appoint, or if they have already appointed a new supreme leader, they will likely not publish it in order to avoid making them a target. But there is general consensus, I think broad consensus among Iran experts, that this is a very broad and very entrenched, not only clerical, but also military regime that relies not on one small group, but that relies on a big array of groups across different institutions that control each other, and that there is no regime change at this time. There is no regime change. They're firmly in. Nothing indicates that they're not firmly in control, unless there would be a breaking of the ranks. But again, I haven't seen any evidence that this is currently the case. And as far as a domestic revolution is concerned, I mean, we've also heard that the Iranian opposition, even though the regime is very unpopular in Iran, there is no organized internal opposition that could topple the regime or lead to regime change in any way. I've also read very skeptical reports about the ability of the Kurds to replace American ground troops or any kind of those slightly outlandish ideas, I have to say, to do that kind of job. So altogether, it seems that not only has the United States stepped away from that proclaimed goal of regime change, it had done so because it seems more and more clear that this is quite unrealistic. Yeah.
Thank you, Christina. So we have very little time until we turn to the questions. But then a question for you. So from your perspective, what's the best case scenario out of this situation, and what would be the worst case scenario?
So maybe I would say three scenarios. One, probably the least likely, that again, I think per Christina's good points on kind of regime change. I mean, there were earlier kind of as the operation kicked off, again, more discussion on the US side of that being a stated objective. it is probably improbable, as of what we are seeing now, that you would have potentially kind of a future more democratic Iran. Obviously, I think that would be, again, personally, for the people of Iran, and we've seen kind of again and again these kind of popular uprisings, that would be a positive outcome. I think what we see right now is it's not certainly the most likely. I think in terms of a decent kind of scenario might be essentially what you again could call kind of regime alteration, where you see the kind of clerical regime and its security forces survive, but very much weakened and much more restrained, both in terms of its kind of behaviors at home and somewhat deterred abroad. So in Iran, that is in a sense better for its people and better for the region, but you don't see kind of a fundamental change. I would say maybe one of the most disruptive scenarios, both kind of internally and externally, would be kind of a real collapse where you see either civil war in Iran or just chaos and then kind of instability radiating outward.
Thank you very much, Dan. This is also the nightmare scenario for Iran's neighbors in the region. So, Beth, I would like to ask the last question to you. So, what are some likely off-ramps from this situation for both the United States and Iran?
Well, I'm gonna forgive me for doing this, but GMF's transatlantic responsibility here, I feel like I need to talk for just a second about the implications of this for Ukraine, because I think it is so important. And there are, you know, kind of very negative possibilities there and positive ones potentially, although those are less. I think that, you know, net Russia wins from this confrontation. They win because, as Christina said, they're going to get more money from their oil. They win because the chances of Ukraine getting more PAC-3 Patriot missiles interceptors right now has just gone off a cliff. There is very little opportunity there from the United States to send them more interceptors. And Europe, you know, we have had the Gulf states now asking Italy and Europe for air defenses because they're feeling so threatened. And then the third thing is that we are going to be in the United States here very, very distracted. We have a lot of things going on, and either we will press Ukraine even harder, but we have seen the president come out just in the past week saying, again, very terrible things about Zelensky and saying positive things, at least privately, about Putin. And I think that this is not a good sign. So I'm concerned. Now, on the other hand, what we know is that Ukraine actually knows how to deal with drones. They have counter drone technology. And this is the beginning, I think, as we're seeing in Europe, of Ukraine and their military industrial complex being the future and being essential. And they've offered their expertise to the Gulf. We'll see how that goes. But I'm on the more concerned end. And then just briefly on the off-ramps, this is going to be up to the United States to decide. And that's what's not good, right? So we may come to a choice, as Dan was talking about, like, and Christina, are we going to choose to do a Libya where when what if the people rise up? Are we going to do a Benghazi, which is what this was about? We were defending the opponents, like the Kurds perhaps, of the regime, and and that led to civil war and the toppling. Or are we going to say, well, we've mission accomplished on our military side, and are we going to just walk away, or somewhere in between? And and this is going to be completely, as Hegseth said yesterday, we will decide when success is done, but none of us know where that is, so we can't really, I don't know.
I mean, a quick question. What happens if the United States and Israel disagree about if mission is accomplished or not?
Absolutely. I mean, Christina and I are on exactly the same page here. And, I think that the United States supported Israel going into this. But at some point, we're going to want to end. This is, war is not just about capabilities on the battlefield. It is a competition of wills, right? And the United States will to continue has a big role here. Israel's will to continue is going to be higher than ours. But at the same time, once they feel that they've had that decapitation, they also very well may be willing to walk away and say, well, we'll just come back and mow the grass as needed once we've destroyed all the capabilities and let the civil war begin. We don't care. So, we're going to have to see how this plays out and who is feeling the pain. One thing that has not been mentioned here is that the Gulf states not only are going to feel pain because of the closing of the straits. Now, maybe that will end sooner rather than later, but it will take a month to put that LNG and for Qatar back up and running. And in the meantime, this will affect fertilizer prices. It's already through the roof. It's going to affect food supplies to the Gulf that get 70% of their foodstuffs through the straits. So the pain of the Gulf also may make a difference. Right now, united, angry at Iran, but they may be more willing to, call it a day. One of the things that I think is missing here is, so we could have an IRGC but we could also ultimately get some kind of moderate or acceptable, or as Trump said, good enough or good leader declared, which is really backed by the IRGC, but we may decide that we're going to, do a deal with a less bad devil. And that has implications too.
Yes, thank you very much. We have a problem. We already have 13 questions. I suspect more will be coming in, which means that we'll have less than 2 minutes to respond to every question, but I'll do my best to address all of the questions. So the first one comes from Raquel Tusa. The question is, Trump has stated that the Iran mission is parallel to the US-Venezuela operation. However, does this comparison overlook the greater complexity of the Iranian regime's institution and network of regional influence? Christina, I think you already alluded to this partly, but your response was about regime change or collapse. How about a Venezuela type solution?
I think the person who asked the question already provided the answer. It seems to me that the timing was very important here because the Venezuela success seemed to have injected in Trump so he was on a sort of on a high, and and also no doubt influenced the decision and maybe informed the misjudgment to go to war in Iran based on the wrong, assessment of how easy it would be to do the same in Iran that they've done in Venezuela. And clearly there was a misjudgment on the weakness and maybe also the structures of the Iranian regime. So I agree with the question, yes.
Thank you, Christina. The second question actually is to me. I'll be very brief in responding. So Steve Flanagan has asked me, Turkish officials must be uneasy about Israel's dominance of the region and instability in Iran. How do you see Turkish policy developing towards both countries? Steve, of course, you know Ankara almost as well as I do, although I live here. And your question also has the answer in it. Ankara is actually very anxious. Ankara sees both Iran and Israel as destabilizing actors. Ankara thinks that Israel's goal in Iran is not regime change, but civil war and chaos. So Ankara has been, doing its best to prevent this operation from happening. And since it started, it's also doing its best to find a way out of the crisis. But Ankara also is increasing, naturally, now given that Iran has sent at least one missile towards Turkey, possibly two, and more may come. Ankara is also getting more and more concerned about Iran as well. And as a result, actually, Turkey is trying to develop its own defense industry, is trying to increase its defensive capacity, build its own integrated air defense system. And I believe that lately also, let's say, close ranks with NATO as well, because As a matter of fact, the Turkish Defense Ministry made the point very strongly that it was actually NATO assets that intercepted the missile coming from Iran. Yes, Beth, very briefly, please.
I wanted to do a two-finger on that and ask you about the how does this idea of the U.S. arming the Kurds and how does Turkey respond to that? It seems like it puts them in a really big pickle in terms of opposing maybe a U.S. policy.
Well, I mean, again, I must be very brief, but I mean, there are two perspectives to this. I mean, first of all, the midterm and long-term security risks for Turkey and the possibility that Turkey would get entangled in this crisis, but also in the short term. Turkey is actually quite close to concluding a peace process with the PKK terrorist organization. So, I mean, Syria was a setback. Now it's resolved. So if Iran comes up as another obstacle and delays the peace process, that would also be very unfortunate for Turkey. So yes, Turkey is alarmed about that prospect, but also, of course, Turkey is now using its channels in Iraqi Kurdistan regional government to talk them out of any intentions that they may have in this direction. So next question is from retired Ambassador Doru Kostea. Iran seems to have struck Azerbaijan, and not only Azerbaijan, the Nahchivan exclave, which is bordering Turkey. President Ilham Aliyev has said Iran has committed a terrorist attack against Azerbaijan by striking one of our airports with drones. This is not the first time Iran has shown its face of terrorism. Iran must apologize or Azerbaijan will not act this go unpunished. So the question is, would any of the distinguished participants care to comment on this? Thank you. Beth, Christina, Dan?
If no one else does, I will. I'm
Please.
not as deep on Caucasus as I should be, but as the questioner I'm sure knows, there have been cross-border attacks. I think some things have blown up in the past 2 years in the Azeri region of Iran, and there is a large consequential, maybe 10% of the population, something like that, 8, I don't know what it is, of Azeri population in Iran. But I think bigger picture here is that we have not potentially seen the end of this regional expansion. And again, I think that, as Christina was saying, part of Iran's aim here is to involve other people, other parts of the region, in order to get those countries to pressure an end. And Azerbaijan has been moving much closer to the United States as well. And so, that is a pressure point I think that they're trying to do. But, obviously the Azeri population, this could really be a number of, we have the Baluch on the border with Pakistan, we have the Azeris, and we have the Kurds, right? These are all large minority populations, all with neighboring separatist kind of terrorist things going on with them, quite destabilizing the Baluch insurgency in Pakistan. And this could definitely spread into Iran and lead to this kind of ethnically based civil war, in addition to just the Persian opposition.
I mean, honestly, Iran's striking Azerbaijan makes me wonder if there is an adult in the situation room in Iran, or even if there is one, because not only do the Azeris constitute 25% of Iran's population, they are the largest ethnic minority in Iran, but they are also very loyal to the regime, and they have been standing in loyalty to the regime
is
right now.
Azerian, right? The president
Yes,
of Iran
yes,
is
yes.
Azeri.
And
they are
of course, they
not
are very much
very
integrated
separatist.
to the system. But I doubt if Iran's Azeri minority is just, very happy about what Iran is doing to Azerbaijan. So this could end up very counterproductive for Iran. So next question from Marcel Schepp from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. In Germany, a big part of the debate is about whether the American-Israeli attack can be justified by international law. Is there a discussion in the US at all? And if yes, what is the spectrum of opinions on that question? Beth, Dan, who would like to take it?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. And Beth, I imagine you'll have some insight to share too. In the US, of course, there are different views. And certainly if people are approaching this from kind of an international legal perspective, you will look at kind of the lack of a UN Security Council debate, much less kind of endorsement. I think, though, when you look at the real political debate here in Washington, it's less about sort of international law and much more about domestic and the role of Congress in kind of approving military operations. And without kind of going down the rabbit hole, I mean, you look at right now, that has been the real action in Congress is to try to force legislation which did not pass the Senate last night, but really to sort of force a war power resolution legislation saying, the Senate and the Congress has to approve kind of declarations of war, use of military force over a certain amount of time. And certainly that's, I would say, has been one of the main areas of kind of divergence here in the US. I think the other is very much hearkening back to Afghanistan and Iraq and real questions about to what extent does this create the potential for kind of an open-ended entanglement in the Middle East. Again, I think national difference here, you see the kind of international law piece, there's disagreement, there's discussion, but it's probably not kind of at the top of the political debate.
Thank you,
Oscar
Martin.
knows a lot about this, but I will just say that when Christina mentioned the Merz comment, I think that the implications of a chancellor of Germany saying that, what was the quote, Christina? I've forgotten exactly, but that international
This is not
law.
the time to think, well, paraphrasing, this is not the time to focus on international law.
Exactly. And I think it's a recognition that international law means less right now. And why is that? It means less because the United States doesn't care about it. As Stephen Miller has said, and the President of the United States has repeated, the United States is operating on the iron law of the world, in which strength and power matter. And so they're basically saying they don't care. And as President Trump said, Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever it is, I don't know what day it is, regarding Spain and the joint base in Spain, if I'm saying that correctly, Christina. We can fly in there. No one can stop us. And so, again, it's the iron law here. And so I think that we can all talk about what Merz is saying is that, look, I believe in international law, but I'm recognizing that the world is not the same. And more, we're going to have some debates about what that means, but Europe still cares about international law.
The number of unaddressed questions has increased to 18.
Yes, but
Christina, please.
I think at this stage we have to recognize we're not going to come to all of them, but I do want to make one point on this. To me, it seems that the from a legal perspective and from an international security order perspective, what this intervention means in conjunction with Venezuela and the Greenland debate is that whereas previous unilateral actions were always tried, where there was always the effort by all international actors to try to justify it on the grounds of international law. That is not the case here. The United States has not produced evidence that there was any imminent threat, and the explicit formulation of regime change as the main goal, at least at some point, of this intervention, shows that they don't even, contrary to the past, they don't even see the need anymore to just justify it on the international, which is one step further. And I think Merz's comments recognize, but also, tacitly condoned that, and that was what provoked the outcry in Germany. And the example from the Spanish bases. No, this is not a joint base. This is sovereign Spanish territory, and under international law, the United States cannot do what it wants. Whether it's going to do so by force, which is obviously just rhetoric from Trump, But we are at a qualitatively different point in terms of exactly what way international law even has on a rhetorical level.
I will skip one question because the next one is also related to Spain, but I want to address it to Dan. So Ali Ercan Özgür, my namesake, is asking, do you expect new alliances to come out of this process, such as rising leadership of Spain like a black swan and making it stand against the Trump administration? And what implications can this have on Latin America strategies of Trump administration?
So I don't necessarily think this will have a kind of direct impact on the Trump administration's approach to Latin America. I would say when you think of new alliances or new configurations, I would say more an acceleration that you've seen Europe, in part because of its concerns about U.S. unpredictability, has already very much been in trying to build up its own, of course, defense capacity, ability to kind of coordinate geopolitically. And I think you'll see an acceleration of that. Again, Europe trying to be more of a kind of independent geopolitical actor because it doesn't feel like it has the ability to kind of shape U.S. choices and actions in the way it did before. So again, more an acceleration of a trend that we've seen.
Thank you very much, Dan. Christina, the next question is also to you, and we have 9 minutes and 20 questions now. This is from Matthew Marcorn. Administration folks and members of Congress state their strategy is to end the Iranian military threat. However, Iran hasn't remotely had any semblance of democracy since 1953. In what world do they think 90 million people have the competency to build a stable government?
Well, quite frankly, I think this is a suggestive question that I'm not sure whether that, it kind of answered itself. So, what is it? This points to the whole complex of questions that we addressed before, that what is the alternative and what are really, at the point where, what's the alternative governance in Iran and where would we get there? So I'm not sure I can contribute more than this question at this point, but I do want to pick up the point on the leadership of Spain in Europe. That was the previous question, because I think it is illusionary to think that Spain would lead, with the assets and with the position it has in the EU, that lead Europe in any other way that it does now. But I do think that there's, in the European response, there are two levels. One is what European leaders think of the American course of action, and the other is how they decide from a tactical and strategic point of view to comment on it in public, obviously. So I do think there is a lot of sympathy for what Sanchez is doing, but most other European leaders think it is unwise to act this way. And in a way, I think, if this example, and Sanchez hasn't seen as of yet any significant reprimands or disadvantages from the United States to his chain of standing up to Trump and his different policies in the last months and couple of years, not even on the NATO, on his refusal to fulfill the NATO 5% pledge. So I think in a way this is a test case with other Europeans looking at what happens to Sanchez. And maybe if nothing happens, that will encourage them to come a little bit more forward in the future, speculative, of course.
Okay, thank you very much, Christina. 6 minutes, 21 questions. Look, it's unrealistic. I wouldn't write new questions because we won't get there. So Ekavi Atanasapoulou, Ekavi, your last name is almost as complicated as mine. Oxford Economics estimates that the conflict will raise Eurozone inflation by 0.3 to 0.5 percentage points in 2026, pushing it to around 2.3%. This increase would add further downside risk to the forecast for 2026 GDP growth. In light of these economic risks, how can the essentially hands-off approach taken by European leaders be explained? Christina, can you respond to that in 20 seconds or less? 25 then. So given the dire economic consequences for the European Union, how can the EU be so offense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure there's much they can do. I mean, they can do about it right now. So in that sense, yes, they will suffer the economic consequences as especially all industrial nations will, and everybody who consumes energy will. But I don't think that is, that comes with empowerment. So yeah, I don't think there's a contradiction there, unfortunately.
Thank you, Krishna. Dan?
So just to jump in on one kind of additional point, I think it's also complex that you can't draw kind of generalizations across all of Europe. At least some European leaders, I would say, have very sharp threat perceptions when it comes to Iran. You can see Chancellor Moritz's comments on kind of the regime. And so I think there is maybe perhaps even a bit of conflictedness in that the regime in Iran is seen as obviously destabilizing. It's seen as threatening its neighbors, as cracking down on its population, and there might be disagreement with kind of the U.S. and Israeli operation and how it's been carried out. But at the same time, the actual threat perception is not as different, and so it's a bit nuanced, perhaps.
Thank you,
I'm
Dan.
wondering if also today, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Russia has made some noises about threatening to cut off gas to Europe. And I think that, the dependency on Europeans' continuing dependency on nat gas, Hungary's efforts to, block support for Ukraine, I think that there could be kind of second and third order effects on some of the European debates. I think it will reinforce not relying on Russia and seeing Russia as a threat. And that will, again, just like U.S. and Israel are diverging, the U.S. and European views of Russia as a threat continue to diverge, are very, very divergent right now. And I think that what happens here, kind of in the cascading, will reinforce that.
Thank you very much, Beth. So there is a Turkey question from Raquel Tusa. What threat does Turkey pose in a post-Iran Middle East, especially in the context of a potential power vacuum following a collapse, significant weakening of the Iranian regime? Anyone who would like to take this? Then I can take this in 5 seconds. Turkey doesn't pose a threat to anyone. Turkey wants stability in the Middle East and good relations with all neighbors. So Matthew McHorn doesn't have a question, but a statement that I would like to read. As a disabled Marine vet, I can tell you we are delusional if we think we can accomplish objectives without boots on the ground. I was one of the boots on the ground. We haven't seen anything yet. So, Matt, I have taken one question and one statement from you, so I'm skipping the next one. And I guess this will be the last question from Alex Raufoğlu. Thanks for doing this. Why would Iran choose to target Nakhchivan specifically? What strategic, geographic, or political significance makes it a pressure point in relations between Iran and Azerbaijan? And what would be the most effective response strategy for Azerbaijan, diplomatic, military, or multilateral, to deter further incidents while avoiding broader regional escalation with Iran? I'll just inject some information into this. So Nakhchivan is an Azeri exclave, but Turkey is a guarantor state in Nakhchivan. So by striking Nakhchivan, if that was intended, then Iran actually sent a message to both Azerbaijan and Turkey. But who would like to take the question? And this will be the last one. It's a bit technical for me. So how could Azerbaijan respond to this, and what precautions could they take?
I think that there is a trip aspect of this, is there not, Asgur, that, the United States is investing in this corridor, and that's a direct threat to Iran, and to, the transit corridors there, and to Russia. I don't know beyond that. I mean, I've asked friends who are Azeri experts and say that Azerbaijan is not going to attack, Iran as a result of this. But I do think that there's a risk of kind of, lower level things happening and the expansion. I wanted to also just say that in terms of, the boots on the ground, we haven't seen anything yet. I'm wondering if the comments by the president and Hegseth to rule out boots on the ground has to do with special forces and maybe CIA special forces supporting the Kurds. I'm just speculating there, but it may not look like, boots marching in or paratroopers, but we could very well have U.S. special forces involved, and this is where we will get the mission creep. Maybe maybe Azerbaijan would participate in something that's similar. Who knows?
Well, please join me in thanking Beth, Christina, and Dan. Unfortunately, we need to end this discussion with 21 outstanding questions. My key takeaways from this is actually this operation has the risk of turning into a mission creep. And actually, there is a risk that the United States and Israel may end up not agreeing on the exit strategy. But should they decide to do so, there are actually off-ramps that they could take. And the implications for Iran, for the regional security architecture in the Middle East, and indeed globally, are very high. Thank you, everyone, for bearing with us.